So let me introduce my colleague as well. This is Dr. Wyman. I'm Mike Buratovich, and we are in the biology department, and welcome to Focus 2013. We are going to talk about genetically modified food, that's made by genetically modified organisms. So we're going to keep using this acronym GM, well, it's not an acronym, it's an abbreviation, GMO over again. It stands for genetically modified organism. So if we say GMO, you say? Okay, good. Then we got that down. So some groups have referred to genetically modified food as Frankenfood. So we'd like to suggest that maybe Frankenfood, in some cases at least, can come to the rescue. So we're going to talk about genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and human health, and the environment. I'd like to suggest to you today that just about all of us in this room, especially those of us in Western society, we're kind of schizophrenic when it comes to technology. We use computers. I would be willing to bet that virtually all of you have either a computer, a DVD player, an Xbox, a PlayStation, an iPod, iPhone, anything like that, within your personal reach at any time during the day. We use these, we accept them uncritically. If we think about just all the areas in technology that we use on a daily basis, and we don't think anything about it. All of these are things, airplanes, and potentially, I suppose, all of these things possess some risk when we use them, and yet I have yet to see anybody worry about the cancer they're going to get from their computer. That's just not something that people worry about. I've never been asked that question. Well, I've been asked that question once, actually. It was by a student who was pregnant. She was worried about the radiation from her computer affecting her baby. That's the only time someone's asked me about that. Well, what about these other things that could actually do a great deal of good that collectively we have a cow about them? We really do. Let's consider something like nuclear power. If you look at the safety record of nuclear power plants and the safety record of coal-fired plants, the safety of nuclear power plants beats coal plants hands down. If you look at the emissions of coal plants versus nuclear power plants, it's not even a contest. And yet, what's the theme about nuclear power in our society? Not in my backyard. We collectively freak out over it. The same thing could be said about agrochemicals. Both of us are sons of farmers. My dad would get up at 3 in the morning, and he'd mix his sulfur, and he'd go out, he'd put the attachment on his Jeep, he'd put on his mask and his earplugs, and he'd go out and he'd spray sulfur all over the field. Sulfur kills these little bitty tiny insects called thrips. And thrips will land on the grape leaves, and they will suck them dry. And the leaves will curl up, and you won't have a grape crop. We would simply use sulfur. Now, the beauty of sulfur is you can take the grape berries and you can wash them with water, and all the sulfur comes off. It doesn't get absorbed into the grapes. And yet, people gave us lots and lots of grief about using elemental sulfur. My goodness, it's on the periodic table. How natural can you get? Now, don't even get me started about organophosphates and stuff like that. Yet people had kittens over sulfur. And genetically modified organisms, Frankenfood and the like. When we talk about genetically modified food, not everyone, but many people really get bothered by it. And yet, folks, I hate to break it to you, for all of your life, probably, you've been eating genetically modified food. Now, it hasn't killed you yet, has it? It hasn't really killed anybody that you know. And yet, when we talk about genetically modified food in the food that we eat, people get very bothered by this. Why is it? Your cell phone could potentially do more damage to you than genetically modified food. Why do we get so upset about this? I think when it comes to science, we're just kind of schizophrenic about our acceptance of it. We accept some things, not others. And let's be honest, we don't really have good explanations why. Well, as it turns out, genetic engineering is actually old hat. It's something that people have been doing for centuries. The Egyptians have been playing around with new breeds of different crops to try and get crops that grew faster, that produced more, that required less care, so on and so forth. People have been messing around with cattle and other types of domestic critters that we eat, like chickens and pork and things like that. Leaner pork, bigger pork, cows that make more milk, so on and so forth. So actually, believe it or not, through conventional breeding programs, we've been messing with their genomes for a long, long time. We just haven't been doing it in a test tube. We've been doing it out in the field. This goes all the way back to 6,000 BC. That's a long time ago. People have been very, very interested in selective breeding of plants and animals and even fungi in Asia. Selective breeding of mushrooms to get mushrooms that taste differently, grow on different things, so on and so forth. It goes way, 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 way back. Better yeast for beer making, and so on and so forth. Other different yeast for various types of wine. How many have heard of a drink that's consumed in Japan somewhat here called sake? Sake is made because there's a special yeast. It's called the sake yeast. And the sake yeast was developed through selective breeding of yeast, of fungi, in order to be able to make this drink that plays a very big role in traditional Japanese culture, sake. Penicillium chrysogenum, which was discovered to make penicillin, the antibiotic, actually by mistake, has been selectively bred in the laboratory so that the concentration of penicillin that it makes has increased 100-fold. This was done before the 1970s. Now, I have not seen anybody freak out about penicillin or freak out about different strains of Penicillium chrysogenum. But when you talk about genetically engineered corn, for some reason, that's a bird of a different feather. Milk, beef, grated milk, you get the point. Cross-pollination, actually, taking two very different species, cross-pollinating them. Now you've got one genome, you're introducing a whole new genome. My word, you talk about genetic engineering, that's genetic engineering to the max. Here's, in fact, where your bread wheat comes from. The bread that you had for breakfast this morning is a product of genetic engineering. You actually take different wild versions of wheat. You merge the two genomes together. They endo-reduplicate, so it becomes fertile. You know what? Then you do it again. And then again. And you finally get bread wheat. Your bread wheat is a hexaploid. It's got 3 different genomes, all plied together. You don't think that's genetic engineering? Gang, I got news for you. It is. It is. And yet we consume this and we don't think anything about it. This phenomenon is called allopolyploidy. The cotton many of you have in your shirts and skirts and socks and so on and so forth. That cotton is a result of a phenomenon like allopolyploidy. Oh, well, you say this occurs naturally, whatever that means. Yeah, it occurs naturally, but the cotton and the wheat that you consume, some of that was done in the laboratory, using the same process, but it was just sped up. But it's the exact same process. So you're introducing an entire genome into the genome of another organism. In modern day genetic engineering, you're not introducing a whole new genome, you're introducing single genes. Gang, think about this. You don't have a problem with organisms that have a whole nother genome introduced into them, but you freak out about something that has one gene introduced into it. Do you see the problem here? Do you see why some people look at this disparity over this angst over genetically engineered food? And we've been doing this for centuries. Except now we can do it on a micro basis, and for some reason that's really, really bad for you. But you eat bread, but you wear cotton. Explain this to me. So, various advances in agriculture, plant breeding and now breeding on the genetic level, produced a so-called Green Revolution. The Green Revolution has taken root coin a phrase, all over the world except in one continent, Africa. Over the past 15 years, the number of Africans who live on less than $1 a day has increased by 50%. The per capita income growth for Africans was negative between 1990 and the year 2000. Africa is the only continent whose agricultural productivity, has decreased in the last 3 decades. The only continent. All the other continents have had their agricultural productivity explode, particularly Asia. In 1966, there was a book written called Famine 1975. It was a very, very popular book. You're way too young to remember that book. Maybe Dr. Webb remembers it. But this book predicted that there'd be massive famines in Asia. That book was spectacularly wrong. Can you guess why? The Green Revolution. The Green Revolution took hold in Asia. Productivity of Asian farms exploded, and Asia now is a group of countries that raises enough food to feed their populations, where before they had to import most of their food. Who was the father of the Green Revolution? I've got a friend who can tell you all about him.
So what is the value of food? Why is food interesting to us? Richard Leakey, anthropologist, made the argument that you have to be well-fed to be a conservationist. It's hard to care about the planet if you're really hungry, and all you need to do is fill your gut. The brain tends to demand ATP. That comes from food. When the brain is hungry, it doesn't think very straight. Alfred Nobel made the argument that he'd rather take care of the stomachs of the living than build monuments to the dead. Yeah, that seems like a pretty Christian concept, doesn't it? And Lord John Boyd Orr argued that you cannot build peace on empty stomachs, because when we get hungry, we get vicious. And we tend to do stupid things. Very stupid things. Norman Borlaug argued that the first essential component of social justice is adequate food for everybody, and that it's a moral right to have food. And he made an interesting statement. It probably is better in his mind, and I would agree with him, to have a problem with too much food than famine. We can help if you're overfed, but if you're starving, that's tough. That's a tough burden. Norman Borlaug was a fascinating gentleman. He was an advocate, a scholar, an athlete, farmer, and a Christian. A handsome man in my view here. This is his mid-50s. This is him at 20. He went to the University of Minnesota on a wrestling scholarship. He grew up in a very small farm town, literally had a single room school from K through 12. Now imagine that, having the same instructor all 12 years. You would think we don't get along well. Imagine doing this for 12 years. Especially you go away in 4 in some cases. And while in school, he was encouraged to go ahead and wrestle. Okay, I could do that. Both of his grandparents were from Sweden and Norway. They were Lutheran ministers. He grew up in the church. And he was informed, you know, the body is a vessel and the mind are vessels for Christ. You want to make them as pure as you can. So he did so through wrestling. 3-time All-American. Not bad. Paid for school. And led him to this person he called his wife. He and his wife were married for 72 years. She preceded him in death by 1 year. They met at the University of Minnesota in a class they took together. It was a relatively rapid courtship. Smart move on his part, clearly. He was a farmer. He grew up on a farm. He spent his entire life on a farm. This is him in the 1940s, working with Mexican farmers. He was initially contracted by the Rockefeller Association, a large conglomerate of charities, to help improve food production in Central America. The idea was, if we can stabilize food production, we can stabilize the region. He lived in Mexico City for 40 years, or just outside. 40 years. Retired in his late 60s, wasn't going to do anymore. A couple years later, got a call from some friends of his in India, and we have a problem, can you come help? Okay, fine. Went to India for 15 years. Retired in his mid-80s. I'm done. Got a call at 88. Need you to come to Africa. Worked in Africa the year before he died. Do that now. We're young. This is a man who was called by Christ to serve humanity by feeding humanity. And that's a driving force that we really need to recognize. This was not a man, however, who didn't have his views. He was very anti-war, extremely pro-environment. He truly felt that the earth needed to be saved, that God gave us this planet, and we needed to protect it. But he wasn't naive. You have to convert habitat to farmland. The question is how much and what do you do with the land you've converted? Do you respect it, you use it wisely, or you just clear cut? You just keep destroying it. He founded, and he hated taking credit for this, but it's true, he was a leading push for the Green Revolution. This effort to increase grain production, cereal production, corn, wheat, rice, to levels that were sufficient to feed the world. And in his efforts, he won a Presidential Medal of Freedom from Carter. He was awarded the Gold Medal from Bush. Created his World Food Prize. You may have heard of this. He won this thing called the Nobel Peace Prize. He was the first scientist to do this. And in his speech, he directly quoted from the Bible 7 times. I'd like you to look through the last 15 Nobel Peace Prizes and see how many people quoted from the Bible. I don't think I can actually ask the question. I think you know the answer already. This is a man who used his Christian faith to drive himself, to say, I am going to do the Lord's work. I am going to feed my brother and feed my sister. His argument was very simple. We have very well-regarded conventional breeding. But that can only plateau. We have reached an upper level. If we start maneuvering with specific genes, we can further build what we've grown. It is very hard to transfer genes from rice to corn. You may have noticed they're a little different. They don't really play well together on their own. Now, you can do it. You can use bacteria, you can use particular viruses, but this takes time and effort, and we don't really have decades to fight famine. But we can move them directly through gene modification. And his argument is simple. We can continue to increase yields and, better yet, decrease cost. Makes sense. We can grow more food on less space. The Green Revolution has actually allowed the United States to reintroduce forests to lands that were cropland in the 30s. We've actually reduced farmland in the United States because of the Green Revolution. Fewer pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers. We reduce, by using these sorts of crops, nitrogen inputs, sulfur inputs, carbon inputs. And we can make food more nutritious. We can actually make it more effective to consume at smaller amounts. And this is probably the key thing of any quote-unquote genetic engineering in terms of single gene points. We have a serious problem on our hands. We are salinizing our soils. We are irrigating so much, we're actually turning farmland into a salty environment. Plants don't really care for salt that much, not so much more than you do, it turns out. We can actually help them tolerate increased salt levels with simple additions of genes. There are some people at Michigan State who have already introduced this. Single gene modification, plant can grow literally in the ocean in terms of salt concentration. Stress levels. Plants get stressed just like you get stressed. And they don't worry about exams, Dr. Wyman gives them. But they do worry about increased radiation, increased heat, and more importantly, increased fungal and viral attacks. We lose anywhere from 25 to 40% of our rice crop every year to fungus. If we could offset that by even 10%, we're talking about billions of bushels of rice. And you may or may not like bananas, but in 10 years, the banana you eat doesn't exist anymore. Now, that won't make you starve, but think about that. In 10 years, there's a good chance the banana you like to consume is going to be gone because of a virus that we really can't stop right now. What if that shifts to wheat, corn, or in my son's case, strawberries? We could have a real problem on our hands. No, he's not going to starve to death, trust me. He also likes raspberries, so we'll be okay. Now, he was not Pollyannish, and neither are Mike or I. GM seeds cost money, because ironically it takes money to build these. It takes both union and non-union labor. And much of the non-union labor has masters or PhDs, and they like to get paid. It's weird how that works. It takes a lot of time to generate these, so the cost of seeds is greater. No one argues that. And companies who make these tend to be private, so they try to patent their seeds. They try to protect their investment. They can't afford to do it for free. These are all legitimate concerns. How is the farmer going to afford this? How does the individual grower afford this? These are all legitimate concerns. But they can be worked out. They can be worked out. And they are being worked out. That is not a reason to stop the process. He believed, like I believe, if we promote human ingenuity, if we allow you all to be the clever, creative people you are and work for the glory of God, we can overcome things. But if we say, oh, we shouldn't do that, and just stop without thinking why, we have a problem on our hands. If we utilize rational rules, I didn't say no rules. Please no. I said no. I didn't say no rules. I said rules are good. Regulations are a good idea. You don't want to kill your consumer. The only foundation I think that does that are cigarette companies. They're the only ones out there who are actually trying to kill their customer slowly, but they are trying to kill their customer. Otherwise, why would a GM company try to kill the people who they're trying to get money from? That doesn't seem very smart, does it? They're not dumb people. We need to have regulation, but let's have an equal playing field. In the back, we brought in a little handout that compares conventionally bred crops with agricultural biotechnology crops. It's interesting, the disparity of rules and regulations between the two. For the last 30 years of his life, Orgel spent a lot of time battling with a number of groups that were pushing against him, particularly urbanists. And he made an interesting point. He said it's easy to be anti-expansion of crops, anti-science, when your stomach is full and you're sitting in a climate-controlled environment overlooking the Potomac River. It's hard when you're sitting in Africa starving to death and you have no way to grow your own food. That's an interesting observation. He really wanted to push for increased scientific and economic education, this idea that if people simply understood what's going on or had a better appreciation, perhaps they wouldn't be so knee-jerk about it. So what is the value of food? Well, the gentleman who took this picture in 1995 took the picture, got on a plane, and thought about this young man. Thought about him for so long that 3 months later took his own life. Because he's pretty sure that child starved to death. He watched that child, he followed that child for 7 miles walking along, trying to get to an aid center. When I get to heaven, I'm not going to explain, or I don't want to explain why I did not do everything in my power to feed my brothers and sisters. I will do it in an intelligent fashion, I will do it in a guarded fashion, but I am not going to explain why I did not do my part to help make sure that stopped while I'm here. Now, we can go too far. I grant you that. Oh, he's kind of cute, right? In an odd way. How can we make genetically modified plants? There are different mechanisms. One is through the use of a bacterium called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. This is a naturally found bacteria. It grows throughout the world, and it infects plants. And it does so by introducing a foreign chunk of DNA called a tDNA. And that tDNA causes the plant cells to divide as if they were undergoing cancerous growth. They develop these huge masses. This is great for the bacteria because as cancer cells develop, they make a lot of sugar. And bacteria love sugar, free food. You've seen this. It's called crown gall. And if you're a fan of the Antiques Roadshow, and if you're not, I'm sorry, you really should become. Every once in a while on Antiques Roadshow, you'll see someone come out with a bowl. And it's a naturally rounded bowl. It's just a wood bowl. If you've seen the side of a tree with a big bump on it, that's a crown gall. That's caused by Agrobacterium. And it forces the wood to grow at a curve, so you get a natural bowl out of it. And it has these beautiful striations because of the xylary elements. Right? Very natural. This happens all the time. Crown gall happens all the time. What we have done is said, well, wait a minute. If the bacteria naturally infects the plant, and the bacteria has a Thai plasmid, a chunk of DNA that's circular that could interact with the plant genome, we could use that. In fact, we do. We take the Thai plasmid and we simply cut it like a pair of scissors. We know exactly where we cut, and we can introduce foreign genes. Say the gene for human insulin. Is human insulin useful? Do you like insulin? Is anybody here against insulin? Okay, just talk. We can then introduce that Thai plasmid into Agrobacterium, and then we simply spray the Agrobacterium onto plant cells. They naturally infect the plant cells. Our plasmid gets introduced into the plant cell, and the plant cell will then turn that DNA over into protein. And we can generate plants that are producing our protein of interest. There are a significant number of farms in the Carolinas that are now growing tobacco that produce human insulin. You can get grams of insulin per plant. Clean, easy to harvest. Right now we make it from bacteria. No one seems to care that we make it from bacteria. But if we make it tobacco, mind you, tobacco is the most evil plant ever. We have a problem with that. Curious. We can also do what's called a gene gun. We can physically take our DNA and stick it onto a gold particle. Now, it seems like a horrible waste of gold, I know, but nonetheless, these are small particles. And we physically can launch the particles at plant tissue or at cells. Every once in a while, the gold particle sticks in the cell. Better yet, sticks in the nucleus, or even better yet, into a chloroplast. And the gene is then uptaken and utilized naturally. So we can actually introduce genes which we can control, which we can regulate expression of, which we know the sequence of directly. There's no guessing. We know exactly what it's going to do. Now, major difference between this and, as Mike points out, conventional breeding. Conventional breeding, you can do all these tricks. You can introduce a gene from one plant to another, but you're also going to introduce 85 of its close friends, potentially. And last time you checked, is it good to have 85 people in one space at a time, or one at a time if you want to meet them all? Better meet them one at a time. Get to know them. Once we make these changes, the GM crop can go immediately out for human consumption. Sorry, the conventionally bred crop can go out immediately for consumption. The GM crop has to go through several rounds of testing before it even gets close to it. Just keep that in mind. We generate GM crops to do all kinds of clever things. For example, resist herbicide. My father has a lovely crop. He plants corn once. He sprays one time for weeds, and never again. Huge decrease in his costs, much better for the environment. So doing 5 applications, 1. He loves it. We have introduced protection against viruses. We introduced protection against all manner of diseases. And we even rigged or generated plants that produce vitamins. Are they safe?
Here's some simple facts about genetically engineered crops. Americans have been growing and consuming food made from genetically engineered crops since 1995. And there were no documented mishaps. None. There was even a scare that GM corn might cause food allergies. That turned out to be a bogus scare. Animal and human feeding studies with GMO crops over and over and over again have failed to document any health problems associated with GMO consumption. There was a paper by a French lab. That French lab conducted a study that was funded by the anti-GMO group Greenpeace. It was published, and then a follow-up study was done, and the study was severely flawed. A sickly strain of mouse was used. Also, the strains of GM crops that were used were strains that were abandoned by companies because they were inferior, and their controlled mice didn't look very healthy either. So that's really the only paper you can point to where rodents fed GM crops showed any problems. No environmental problems that have been documented as a result of growing GM crops. We'll talk about some that were thought to be problems that turned out not to be. In fact, wherever GM crops have been introduced, pesticide use has plummeted. And that's a good thing. Also, wherever GM crops have been introduced, the amount of land that is cleared for agriculture has gone down. So also there's less soil tillage. That means less CO2 released. That means less greenhouse gas produced as well. So the net result for the environment is actually good. Farmers who grow GM crops, again, use significantly less pesticides, significantly less herbicides. Aaron's dad is not an unusual example. Wherever these crops are used, less pesticides and herbicides are used. Now, there were some findings that caused some people to have pause. There was a paper published in 1999. It was a rodent feeding study with GM potatoes. This was published in the very famous British medical publication, The Lancet. This particular study suggested that rats that were fed with GM potatoes developed a variety of health problems. When you read the paper closely, the control group also had a lot of problems that the experimental group had. So the control group that was fed non-GM potatoes, they had problems too. So there's a problem here with your experiment overall. And after this paper came out, the Royal Society, which is the most prestigious academic medical group in the United Kingdom, completely disavowed the conclusions of this paper. It's not because the Royal Society is in the deep pocket of biotechnology. It's because the paper represented a flawed study. It was bad science. Subsequent feeding studies that repeated the same type of experimental strategy failed to document any problems associated with GMOs. And here are some of the references of these repeated studies for those who might be interested. There was also a report in the very prestigious journal Nature in 1999 that monarch butterfly larvae are killed by pollen produced by BT corn. BT corn is a type of genetically engineered corn. It makes a toxin that is poisonous to certain insect pests. Now there's a problem here. The time of year during which the corn produces a pollen and the time of year during which the monarch larvae develop are at different times of the year. So you have a great disparity in the times these two things come out or are produced. How do they meet each other? When do they ever come together and manage to feed on one another, so to speak? 6 field studies, and all these are published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showed essentially that monarch butterfly populations do not show deleterious effects as a result of BT crops. In fact, several studies have shown that wherever BT crops are planted, the monarch population has gone up. Thirdly, there was a concern that genes from GM crops could somehow make their way into the environment. This is particularly a concern in Europe because in America, our farmland tends to be seconded from the rest of the wildlife. In Europe, farmland and wildland will tend to run right up against each other. However, this study that again was published in Nature, that tended to show that a transgene, the introduced foreign DNA in BT corn, made its way into local varieties. The problem with this paper is that several labs tried to repeat the study and not a single group, and there were several groups that tried, could replicate these studies. So this turned out to be a bogus study. In fact, the use of GM crops has been endorsed, and this is frankly a short list, by many, many, many of the major academic scientific organizations in the United States and in Europe. You see there are French, German, British societies, also global organizations, the World Health Organization, United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. These are not politically conservative outfits that tend to favor any sort of corporate action. Yet because of the lack of any demonstrated risk, either short-term or long-term, to consumption of GM foods, either for people consuming them or the environment, to the demonstrated benefits of GM foods, these organizations have come out strongly in favor of GM foods. Well, then why don't we trust them? We don't. The surveys clearly show that. This is from the Pew Initiative in 2005. Here in our own country, half of Americans oppose the introduction of GM foods into the US. Now, the same half of Americans are not aware they've been eating GM foods for the past 25 years. Excuse me, 15 years. Only 25% of US respondents believe they'd ever eaten them, and a third of consumers in the US were even aware that GM foods were sold in the US. So we're opposed, but we're also ignorant. A Rutgers food policy study in 2003 showed that 45% of Americans felt that consumption of GM foods was safe, but 54% felt that GM food threatens the natural order of things. It didn't ask them to define that very slippery term, but that's what it said. 62% felt that some sort of serious accident involving GM foods was just inevitable, it was going to happen. And 2/3 of Americans opposed importing GM foods into the country, even though that's been done now for quite a while. So here's the statement. Do you agree or disagree with it? The benefits of genetically modified crops are greater than the risks. In the US, you can see it's pretty evenly split, opposed or approve. The rest are, I know it doesn't add up to 100, the rest are in the category of, I don't know. In the United Kingdom, as you can see, and this tends to be the case across Europe, the opposition to GM foods is much, 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 much stronger. In 2000, 35,000 respondents in 35 different countries were asked if they agreed with the following statement. The benefits of using biotechnology to create genetically modified food crops that do not require chemical pesticides are greater than the risks. And as you can see, in Europe, the answer tends to be no. However, if you go to places like China, Cuba, Indonesia, and so on and so forth, you can see that there's a trend. Europeans, who tend to be well-fed, don't like GMOs. You get to poorer countries, now they're pretty thrilled with them. A 2006 Sensibility survey among respondents who were aware of GMOs, 89% of Greeks thought that they were harmful, but only 33% of South Africans thought the same. South Africa is the only country that has embraced genetically modified crops. South African agriculture outdoes almost the rest of Africa. And you may have read in the papers recently that Zambia completely reversed its stance on GMOs just recently. Zambia, by the way, was the country that in 2002, after 2 years of famine, rejected many tons of US corn because they thought it might contain genetically modified corn. And they demanded that it have to be milled before it be used. Their people were starving, they were turning away food, even though they had accepted this same food for the last several decades. So here's the trend. The richer the country, the more skeptical citizens are of GMOs. This trend has been repeated over and over and over again in surveys. How do we regulate them, and how can we regulate them sensibly? And for the Jane Austen fans, there's Andrew Davies' version of Sense and Sensibility.
In 1989, NRC came up with a statement to help guide research. This was then picked up within Europe. European organizations of the similar ilk said, yeah, we agree. Regulation of GMO should be dependent on what is made, not how it's made it. The key is what is the end product? How will that impact human existence, life on the planet? Keep in mind that there are significant regulations on GMOs. They have to be regulated by the EPA in the United States, the FDA in the United States, the USDA. Conventionally bred crops, none of the above. And yet they both are used for herbicide resistance generation. Here's it. GMOs undergo a very stringent set of criteria before they even get close to humans. Conventionally bred crops, yeah, not so much. And that can have outcomes. For example, potatoes contain solanine, which is toxic. In fact, my grandfather used to tell my brother and I that when we saw the green potatoes in the shed, to stay away from them, because they're full of this. If you eat them, it'll kill you. It kills rats really well, too. Really, really well. Yeah, those aren't genetically modified. The potatoes just make that naturally. That's it. We actually have red potatoes to make more of it, conventionally. Oh, okay. Well, we don't test for it, though. It's okay. Celery, yeah. Celery contains material called solarins, and many of us like to eat celery because it helps us lose weight. Now, it turns out when you're harvesting celery, you can get these really interesting lesions on your skin. Yeah, these aren't genetically modified, but USDA doesn't regulate this, the EPA doesn't regulate this, the FDA doesn't regulate that. Does that look like it might hurt? Yeah, I would say it might hurt. That's not uncommon. Those are pretty common rashes, it turns out. Okay. Neither of those are genetically modified. That is quote unquote natural. That's just natural breeding. I'm not saying, neither is saying that GM crops should be ignored for testing. No, no, no. We don't want you to be injured, but let's be rational in our approach. Let's be even-handed in our approach. In Europe, there has been this idea of the precautionary principle, which literally argues that we have to put on immediate preventive measures to ward off any risks that may happen, regardless of probability, for the future. Using this precautionary principle, new technologies are almost impossible because you can't do enough testing to overcome what might happen. Using this principle, we would never have made penicillin because a few of you are allergic to penicillin. Wait a minute, that might kill you. Yeah, nearly killed my dad when he was 1. Imagine we didn't have penicillin, because we wouldn't under this principle, because there's the possibility it could kill you. Before any testing, we would immediately abandon it. Before any study, we would immediately abandon it. This is a dangerous game, very dangerous game. Now, there are a number of organizations who have basically made it their mission to stop GMOs under any circumstance. For any number of reasons, they have theirs. Right? And to prevent any research on these. This is unfortunate because we can utilize modification to help our fellow man. Left and right, we have rice. Rice is eaten by a tremendous population on our planet. Rice in and of itself is pretty low in overall nutrients and has almost no vitamin appeal. But if we could help rice make vitamins, it would actually increase nutrition value. The rice on the right that's quote unquote yellow, which is called golden rice, has had 2 additional enzymes added that the rest of the plant makes, but the white endosperm doesn't. So it's not foreign to the plant, just to that part of the plant, the part that we consume. Right? By playing with or modifying an existing enzymatic pathway, we have not introduced a pathway, it's there. We've introduced 2 genes, Psi and Crete1. Psi from corn and Crete1 from a bacteria. Now the endosperm can convert a variety of precursors down to beta-carotene. Wait a minute, beta-carotene, sounds familiar. Yeah, so it makes your carrots orange. And we tell you to eat carrots because it's good for your eyes. Oh. Now, if you're not used to eating carrots, are you going to be fond of eating carrots? But if you're used to eating rice, might you eat rice? We have to think about cultural needs for food. Culture has a big impact on what we consume. If you're Scottish, you might eat haggis. But if you're not Scottish, the odds of you eating haggis are pretty slim. Right? Vitamin A deficiency is extremely prevalent within poor cultures. Rice in itself does not make provitamin A, the precursor to A. And if you don't consume foods that have this, this could cause a real problem. So who came up with this idea that, you know, we've got 250 million children out there who have VAD. If we could just give them a sufficient amount of VAD, we could drop this problem. VAD leads to this problem called blindness, ultimately death. The picture here shows a child with VAD who's 4 years old. Could be prevented by simply providing sufficient vitamin A. Now, we could certainly provide them with tablets, but tablets are hard to digest and are poor in bioavailability. Whereas if you consume vitamin A twice a day in rice, you build up the sufficient content in a hurry, and your stomach is full. So you get a full tummy, and you prevent blindness. Hey, that's a clever idea. It looks the same out in the field. It grows the same out in the field. It smells the same. It tastes the same, based on studies. Green paste said no. First, it made too much vitamin A. Impossible. If you get too much vitamin A, you turn your child orange. I've done it. It's kind of entertaining. You have too much vitamin, too little vitamin A? No, that's an issue. They're already getting too little. If you get none, it's hard to get less than 0. All right, that's not going to work. But golden rice has been tested time and again and compared to spinach and supplements. It's just as good as supplements, plus it fills your belly. And it's better than spinach. Plus, the people being provided this are used to rice. They've seen rice. Rice is part of their diet. Spinach wasn't. They weren't sure what to do with spinach. I know what to do with spinach. Throw it out. That's not here.
Well, in response to this, Greenpeace had kittens. And then they started to, well, stretch the truth. They just told lies. So they claimed that the Chinese parents whose children had been involved in the studies, essentially, their children were stolen from them and used as guinea pigs without their consent. The problem with this is that several bioethicists, the most prominent of which was Art Kaplan at the University of Pennsylvania, actually looked over the protocol and said, the forms that the Chinese parents read and signed are right here in the report. Had Greenpeace actually read the report, they would have seen this. So either A, Greenpeace can't read, or B, they read it and just lied about it. Well, which is it? One, they're dishonest. The other, they're ignorant. So in either way, you shouldn't really listen to them. Greenpeace has gone to the Philippines and spread the same message. Consequently, golden rice cannot be tested in the Philippines because Greenpeace has mobilized the Catholic Bishops' Conference against golden rice. And Wilhelmina Pellegrina, a Greenpeace spokesperson, wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal in which, frankly, she lied through her teeth. She said, we're not sure golden rice is safe. No, Wilhelmina, you're not sure golden rice is safe. The researchers who tested it know it's safe. Despite millions of dollars and 20 years spent on research and development, golden rice remains a project with no application for commercialization anywhere in the world. You know why? Because Greenpeace are the ones who take the experimental fields and burn them. That's why this commercialization has not occurred. Our objections to genetic engineering in food and agriculture are rooted in science, boulder dash. Regulation has to do with what you make, not with how it's made. Greenpeace is opposed to golden rice because of how it's made. Their objection is a religious objection. It's not natural because it was somehow made in a test tube. That's why they object to it. Forget the blind kids. Forget the kids who will have bowed legs because of rickets. We have this religious objection, and you need to adhere to our religion too. That's really what it comes down to. So here's just some information you can use. And we also have handouts in the back. And here's some very, very, very good references for you to read about this issue. We're running short on time. So we'll open it now for a few questions, but I know you guys need to get to